In 1911, shipments of steel beams thundered through midnight Manhattan, destined for a project that would reshape the city's skyline, built not with modern cranes, but with muscle, sweat, and nerve. Beneath those crowded streets, workers known as Sandhogs risked decompression sickness to sink massive caissons over 100 feet into bedrock, laying the foundations for skeletons of steel that seemed impossible for their time. If you think building skyscrapers in the 1910s was risky, the truth about their methods and the cost they carried will make you question how any of these giants still stand. So how did they actually pull it off, floor by floor? Steel for the city's new towers began its journey hundreds of miles from Manhattan. In the mills of Pittsburgh and Bethlehem, molten iron was poured, rolled, and pressed into beams stretching up to 40 feet long and weighing as much as 20 tons apiece. Each beam was stamped, sorted, and loaded onto rail cars bound for New York, joining a convoy that would supply the skeletons of the city's next generation of skyscrapers. The logistics behind these shipments demanded a level of precision that rivaled the engineering itself. Rail clerks in distant offices tracked every load, timing departures so that steel would arrive in the city just as the site was ready to receive it, no sooner, no later. There was no room to stack beams on a narrow Manhattan lot. Freight yards along the Hudson buzzed with activity as shipments arrived, often under cover of darkness to avoid the crush of daytime traffic. City permits allowed only brief street closures, sometimes at midnight, to move the steel from rail to the edge of the construction site. Wagons and trucks lined up along Broadway and Park Place, each carrying their share of the building's future frame. Every delivery had to be choreographed down to the minute. A single missed train or a delayed wagon could stall the entire operation, leaving workers idle and the schedule in jeopardy. On the ground, a logistics clerk served as the nerve center for the flow of steel. With a ledger in hand, he checked off each arrival, coordinated with foremen, and secured the necessary street permits for unloading. The beams, some as long as city buses, were hoisted directly from wagons by steam-powered derricks, swinging overhead before ever touching the pavement. This just-in-time approach kept the site clear for the next phase, excavation and caisson sinking, while ensuring the steel was always within reach when the foundation was ready. The entire process unfolded against the relentless pace of city life. Traffic surged around the barricades, streetcars rattled past, and the night air rang with the clang of steel meeting steel. Each beam that arrived on schedule was a small triumph of planning and nerve, setting the stage for the foundations that would soon anchor these giants in stone and bedrock. Beneath the city's rush, the real work began far below street level. Pneumatic caissons, giant steel boxes, were lowered into hand-dug pits, their walls sealed tight against the muddy chaos of Manhattan's subsoil. Pressurized air filled these chambers, keeping water and loose earth at bay, while crews known as Sandhogs crawled through airlocks to dig deeper, foot by foot. For the Woolworth building, 66 caissons had to reach bedrock as much as 130 feet down, some wider than a city bus. The ground above never stopped pulsing, streetcars rattled, horses clattered. But below, the world was silent except for the scrape of shovels and the hiss of leaking air. Inside the caisson, time followed a different rhythm. Sandhog Mike O'Rourke, boots caked with mud, spent 6-hour shifts in the compressed gloom, prying away gravel and quicksand with nothing but a pick and a wheelbarrow. The pressure was so high that his ears rang and his joints ached with every movement. When the airlock finally opened, Mike climbed out trembling, sweat streaked with grit, his hands shaking from the bends, a sickness that haunted every sandhog who worked under pressure. Caisson disease struck without warning, a sharp pain in the joints, sometimes paralysis, sometimes worse. There were no guarantees, just the hope that slow decompression and a good doctor could keep a man walking. The deeper the caisson sank, the greater the risk. Some days the crew hit pockets of quicksand or stray into a forgotten sewer, forcing them to improvise repairs on the fly. The caisson would lurch and settle, the air thick with the smell of oil and sweat. But the work pressed on. Once the bottom reached solid rock, the crew poured concrete to lock the caisson in place, then built a pier up to street level. On top of these piers, steel grillages, massive beams set in layers, spread out the weight of the future skyscraper, forming a grid that could carry the load of 50 stories above. By the end of August 1911, the last caisson was set and sealed, the underground phase finished. The city above barely noticed, but below, men like Mike had carved out the bedrock foundation that would hold up the Woolworth building for a century to come. Steel beams, fresh from the mills and hoisted by steam-powered derricks, arrived at the edge of the foundation, ready for a new kind of assembly. Instead of thick masonry, the building's weight would travel through a lattice of columns and girders, each joint locked tight by red-hot rivets. Connectors perched on narrow flanges guided the next beam into position. They worked without harnesses, balancing above open air, as the derrick man eased each 20-ton piece into place with inch-by-inch precision. Once the holes aligned, the real choreography began. A 4-man riveting gang moved in. Down below, a forge kept rivets glowing orange. The passer scooped one up with tongs and tossed it skyward, sometimes 50 feet or more, toward the waiting catcher, called the heater. A missed catch meant a molten missile tumbling to the street. When the rivet landed, the holder-on braced it in the hole with a heavy bar, his body pressed against cold steel. On the other side, the bucker-up hammered the rivet's tail, flattening it into a mushroom. Each blow sent shockwaves through the frame, the clang echoing across the city. The process was relentless. Hundreds of rivets were set each shift, locking beams together so tightly that the frame became a single rigid skeleton. Wind-bracing members followed, bolted and riveted in cross patterns to resist the force of Atlantic gales. The load path was clear. Weight from every floor traveled down through columns, across grillages, and finally into the bedrock below. Mistakes had consequences. A misaligned hole could stall a crew for hours. A dropped rivet could mean a serious injury. For the holder-on, the work was a test of nerve and timing, a split-second window to catch, set, and brace before the hammer fell. By sunset, the frame had grown another story. The city's newest tower was locked together, joint by joint, its skeleton visible for miles. The rhythm of the riveters, heat, toss, catch, hammer, became the heartbeat of progress, echoing across the skyline as the building reached ever higher. A single whistle blast cut through the clatter, and the derrick man responded without hesitation. He eased the cable, swinging a steel beam in slow, deliberate arcs over the heads of men below. On the skeleton of the rising tower, a connector crouched, arm raised, palm out, his silent cue for hold. No radios, no loudspeakers. Every move relied on a visual code, a circling fist to signal swing, a sharp wave for lower, or a flat palm slicing the air for stop. Shouted orders from the foreman, perched on a plank above the fray, kept the rhythm tight. Amid the chaos, each gang knew its part. Derrick men handled the hoists, connectors guided the beams, and riveters locked the frame together. But as steel reached its full height, a new team took over, the Terra cotta hangers. These men worked with a different kind of precision. Instead of wrestling beams, they handled ornate panels, each one molded and fired off-site, then delivered to the foot of the tower. The panels, made of lightweight, fireproof terracotta, arrived by wagon and were hoisted floor by floor, following the steel as it climbed. Hangers moved quickly, guiding each piece into place along the frame's anchor clips. A tap of the mallet, a twist of wire, and the panel locked tight, forming a seamless skin over the steel bones. It was a process as much about speed as craftsmanship. Every panel had to fit perfectly, or the whole pattern faltered. A curtain wall of cream-colored terracotta soon wrapped the building, transforming the exposed lattice into a finished tower. The hangers worked in teams, racing the bricklayers and glaziers up the scaffold, their hands caked with mortar as they pressed Gothic arches and floral details into place. From the street, the change was dramatic. In a matter of weeks, the raw skeleton vanished behind a gleaming facade. Each panel hung as precisely as a clockwork gear. The foreman, eyes scanning the work from above, watched for gaps, crooked lines, or a missed anchor, his reputation riding on every detail. Communication remained everything: a whistle, a shout, a flash of the hand, keeping hundreds of men in sync as the city's new giant took its final shape. Records from the Woolworth building site in the spring of 1912 tell the story in numbers that still stagger engineers today. In just 6 days, crews assembled 1,153 tons of steel, enough to stretch across city blocks if laid end to end. The frame rose at a pace that approached a floor every week, a rhythm set by the relentless drive to outpace rivals and meet the demands of ambitious owners. Timekeepers on site tracked every delivery and every shift, their ledgers filling with figures that measured progress in tons and hours instead of days and weeks. The building's skeleton seemed to leap skyward, each new story a testament to calculated speed. But speed came at a price. The men who bolted and riveted those beams worked without harnesses, nets, or even guardrails. Perched on 12-inch flanges, they moved with the wind, trusting balance and muscle memory to keep them from plunging hundreds of feet. There was no pause for safety checks. Every lost minute risked falling behind schedule. The city's newspapers cheered the race to the top, but rarely mentioned the injuries or the men who never came home. On a site where a single misstep could mean disaster, risk was as much a part of the job as the steel itself. The numbers told one story: unmatched speed, a record pace, a tower rising faster than any before. The reality on the beams told another, of men working at the edge of possibility, where progress was measured not just in floors added, but in lives risked with every step. Broadway offered little more than a sliver of real estate, just 70 feet wide and 152 feet long, hemmed in by traffic, streetcars, and the shadows of older buildings. Every square foot counted. The only way to make the numbers work was to build up, not out. That meant packing as much rentable space as possible into a footprint barely larger than a tennis court, while leaving room for the machinery that made a tall building practical: elevators. The city required permits for every street closure, each one issued by a clerk who kept a tight grip on the schedule. Miss your window and the next delivery had to wait, sometimes for days. The permit officer, ledger open, checked off times and dates, watching the parade of wagons and derricks that blocked the curb. Out on the street, beams swung overhead in narrow arcs, guided by men who had memorized the dance of the city's traffic, as well as the signals from the foreman. There was no margin for error. A misjudged swing might clip a trolley wire or send a wagon careening into the crowd. Inside the lot, the building's core took shape first. Otis traction elevators, the most advanced of their day, demanded a central shaft, about 35 feet square, carved straight down to the caissons. This core became the spine of the tower, rising floor by floor alongside the steel frame. Every decision revolved around it: stairwells, pipes, and even the placement of the restrooms. With the core tucked tightly in the middle, the remaining space could be carved into offices just wide enough for a desk and a window. Profit was measured in inches. The higher the tower rose, the more rent could be charged for each square foot of daylight and skyline. On a lot this tight, the elevator core was not just an engineering solution, it was the key to turning a narrow patch of land into a vertical engine of commerce. Preserving a steel giant from the 1910s demands a new kind of expertise, one that blends old-world craftsmanship with digital precision. Engineers now begin with a laser scan, capturing every inch of the Woolworth building's frame and facade in three-dimensional detail. Drones sweep the spires, mapping cracks in the terracotta skin and tracing subtle shifts in the steel beneath. Each scan feeds into a building information model, or BIM, creating a virtual twin where every rivet, splice, and caisson can be inspected from a laptop. Inside the digital model, preservation teams hunt for signs of trouble. Sensors embedded in the structure monitor for moisture creeping into the caisson seals, an invisible threat that can corrode steel and weaken the concrete poured over a century ago. Engineers check the integrity of original rivet splices, comparing data against century-old blueprints and modern safety metrics. When a weak point appears, targeted repairs follow. Stainless steel pins replace failing anchors, and micro cameras probe deep into foundation piers. The goal is surgical: fix only what is needed and keep as much original fabric as possible. Each intervention is logged, measured, and mapped, ensuring that the Woolworth skeleton remains as strong and true as the day it first rose above Broadway. A century separates the first steel skeletons from the digital scans that now preserve them, but the lessons of the 1910s are etched in every floor and shaft. Look closely at the Woolworth building's elevator core, 35 feet square, carved straight through the heart of a 70-foot wide lot. That original geometry, dictated by Otis traction technology and the economics of tight city real estate, still shapes what is possible today. Modern engineers, armed with drones and building models, find their options bounded by the choices made in 1911. The elevator shafts, built for cars a fraction of the size of today's, set hard limits on how fast or how many can rise through the tower. Upgrading for speed means working within walls that cannot be moved, steel that cannot be cut without risking the structure's spine. Preservation engineer Jeremy Edwards puts it plainly: you can swap out the machinery, but the shaft is forever. The original frame decides what is possible 100 years later. Every restoration becomes a negotiation with the past, matching new systems to old spaces, reinforcing caissons without disturbing the concrete poured by sandhogs long gone. These buildings endure because their makers built with margins and muscle, but their constraints endure too. The ingenuity that squeezed a vertical city out of a narrow lot still challenges those who care for these giants today. In every scan, every retrofit, the handwork and hard choices of builders from the 1910s remain the foundation for what is possible now. Those hand-built towers still define city skylines, proof that ingenuity can outpace technology. Today, as cities grow ever taller, their foundations trace back to human grit and coordination, not just machines. Building up remains an act of collective ambition. The next time you look up, remember, progress is measured not only in steel, but in the risks we are willing to take. Share your thoughts below.